So we will be reading Arnold Bennett's News of the Engagement. And I have. My mother never came to meet me at Brosey Station when I arrived in the Five Towns from London. Much less did she come as far as Knype Station, which is the great traffic centre of the district, the point at which one changes from the express into the local train. She had always other things to do. She was preparing for me. So I had a little journey from Knype to Bursley, and then the walk up Trafalgar Road amid the familiar high chimneys and the smoke and the clay, mud, and football posts and the Midland accent all by myself, and there was leisure to consider anew how I should break to my mother the tremendous news I had for her. I had been considering the question ever since getting into the train at Euston, where I had said goodbye to Agnes. But in the atmosphere of the Five Towns, it seemed just slightly more difficult, though, of course, it wasn't difficult, really. Five Towns is significant because that's the book that this short story was in. As you can see, The Grim Smile of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. You see, I wrote to my mother regularly every week, telling her most of my doings. She knew all my friends by name. I dare say she formed in her mind notions of what sort of people they were. Thus, I had frequently mentioned Agnes and her family in my letters. But you can't write even to your mother and say in cold blood, I think I'm beginning to fall in love with Agnes. I think Agnes likes me. I am mad on her. I feel certain she likes me. I shall propose to her on such a day. You can't do that. At least I couldn't. Hence, it had come about that on the 20th of December I had proposed to Agnes and been accepted by Agnes, and my mother had no suspicion that my happiness was so near. And on the 22nd, by a previous unalterable arrangement, I had come to spend Christmas with my mother. And now we have our conflict. I was the only son of a widow. I was all that my mother had, and lo, I had gone and engaged myself to a girl she had never seen, and I had kept her in the dark. She would certainly be extremely surprised, and she might even be a little bit hurt, just at first. Anyhow, the situation was the least in the world delicate. So here we have why his conflict is maybe more extreme than your typical young guy's conflict with his mother. I walked up the whitened front steps of my mother's little house, just opposite where the electric cars stop. But before I could put my hand on the bell, my little plump mother, in her black silk and gold brooch, and her auburn hair, opened to me, having doubtless watched me down the road from the bay window, as usual. And she said, as usual, kissing me, Well, Philip, how are you? And I said, Oh, I'm all right, mother. How are you? We do have the narrator's name here as Philip. I perceived instantly that she was more excited than my arrival ordinarily made her. There were tears in her smiling eyes, and she was as nervous as a young girl. She did indeed look remarkably young for a woman of 45, with 25 years of widowhood and a brief but too tempestuous married life behind her. This would tell us that our narrator has to be at least 25 if his father died 25 years ago. The thought flashed across my mind. By some means or other, she had got wind of my engagement, but how? But I said nothing. I too was naturally rather nervous. Mothers are kittle cattle. I'll tell her at supper, I decided, and she hovered round me like a seagull round a steamer as I went upstairs. There was a ring at the doorbell. She flew instead of letting the servants go. It was a porter with my bag. Just as I was coming downstairs again, there was another ring at the door, and my mother appeared magically out of the kitchen. But I was beforehand with her, and with a laugh I insisted on opening the front door myself this time. A young woman stood on the step. Please, Mrs. Dawson wants to know if Mrs. Durrance can kindly lend her half a dozen knives and forks. Eh, with pleasure, said my mother behind me. Just wait a minute, Lucy. Come inside on the mat. I followed my mother into the drawing room where she kept her silver in a cabinet. That's Mrs. Dawson's new servant, my mother whispered, but she needn't think I'm going to lend her my best, because I'm not. I shouldn't if I were you. I supported her. And she went out with some second best in tissue paper and beamed on Mrs. Dawson's servant with assumed benevolence. There, she exclaimed, and the compliments of the season to your mistress Lucy. After that, my mother disappeared into the kitchen to worry an entirely capable servant. You could use this as characterization. If she's worrying an entirely capable servant, it means she's like standing over her, pestering her, you could say. And I roamed about feeling happily excited, examining the drawing room in which nothing was changed except the incandescent light and the picture postcards on the mantelpiece. Then I wandered into the dining room, a small room at the back of the house, and here an immense surprise awaited me. Supper was set for three. Well, I reflected, here's a nice state of affairs, supper for three, and she hasn't breathed a word. My mother was so clever in social matters, and especially in the planning of delicious surprises, that I believed her capable even of miracles. In some way or other, she must have discovered the state of my desires towards Agnes. She had written, or something. She and Agnes had been plotting together by letter to startle me, and perhaps telegraphing. Telegraphing would be a phone of the time. So that's how you could know it was written in early 1900s because of, or late 1800s, early 1900s because of the telegraph. Agnes had fibbed in telling me that she could not possibly come to Brussels for Christmas. She had delightedly fibbed, and my mother had got her concealed somewhere in the house, or was momentarily expecting her. That explained the tears, the nervousness, the rushes to the door. I crept out of the dining room, determined not to let my mother know that I had secretly viewed the supper table, and I was crossing the lobby to the drawing room. There was a third ring at the door, and a third time my mother rushed out of the kitchen. By Jove, I thought, suppose it's Agnes, what a scene! And trembling with expectation, I opened the door. It was Mr. Nixon. And now Mr. Nixon was an old friend of the family's, a man of 49 or 50 with a reputation for shrewdness and increasing wealth. He owned 175 cottages in the town, having bought them gradually in half dozens, and in rows he collected the rents himself and attended to the repairs himself, and was celebrated as a good landlord, and as being almost the only man of Bursey who had made cottage property pay. He lived alone in Commerce Street, and though not talkative, was usually jolly, with one or two good stories tucked away in the corners of his memory. He was my mother's trustee, and had morally aided her in the troublous times before my father's early death. That is super important, and I'll save it. A trustee would be someone who takes care of someone's money in like an account. So typically, if you ever heard of a kid being called a trust fund kid, that would mean when that child turned 18, he would have this trust, this money available to him. But while the child was under 18, he or she would be receiving money, but only if it was approved by a trustee. Um, Now, what makes this interesting and part of the time period is that normally, nowadays, if someone's husband died, they wouldn't have a trustee overseeing their money. They would just, a woman would just be given the money to have her own bank. But during this time, that wasn't a thing. So his mother wasn't trusted. Well, any mother wasn't trusted. So it was typical that if it was a woman, her money had to be held by someone that would be responsible. And that's Mr. Nixon. Well, young man, he cried, you're back in old Balsley. It amused him to speak the dialect a little occasionally. And he brought his burly, powerful form into the lobby. I greeted him as jovially as I could, and then he shook hands with my mother, neither of them speaking. Mr. Nixon has come for supper, Philip, said my mother. I liked Mr. Nixon, but I was not too well pleased by this information, for I wanted to talk confidentially to my mother. I had a task before me with my mother, and here Mr. Nixon was plunging into the supper. I could not break it gently to my mother that I was engaged to a strange young woman in the presence of Mr. Nixon. Mr. Nixon had been to supper several times during previous visits of mine, but never on the first night. You could say that's a little weird, right? And maybe we could even say that might be foreshadowing. There's other foreshadowing I have to go through here. All right. Oops. Foreshadowing. However, I had to make the best of it, and we sat down and began the ham, the sausages, the eggs, the crumpets, the toasted jams, the minced tarts, the Stilton, and the celery, and we none of us ate very much, despite my little plump mother's protestations. My suspicion was that perhaps something had gone slightly wrong with my mother's affairs, and that Mr. Nixon was taking the first opportunity to explain things to me. But such a possibility did not interest me, for I could easily afford to keep my mother and a wife too. I was still preoccupied in my engagement, and surely there is nothing astonishing in that. And I began to compose the words in which, immediately on the departure of Mr. Nixon after supper, I would tackle my mother on the subject. When we reached the Stilton and Celery, I intimated that I must walk down to the post office and I had to dispatch a letter. Won't it do tomorrow, my pet? Asked my mother. It will not, I said. Imagine leaving Agnes 2 days without news of my safe arrival and without assurances of my love. I had started writing the letters in the train near Willesden, and I finished it in the drawing room. A lady in the case? Mr. Nixon called out gaily. This would be an idiom, a lady in the case, meaning like that's the case, you have a lady, that's why you need to send it. Yes, replied with firmness. I went forth, bought a picture postcard showing St. Luke's Square, Berthsey, most untruthfully picturesque, and posted the card and the letter to my darling Agnes. I hoped that Mr. Nixon would have departed ere my return. He had made no reference at all during supper to my mother's affairs, but he had not departed. I found him solitary in the drawing room, smoking a fine cigar. Where's the matter? I demanded. She's just gone out of the room, he said. Come and sit down. Have a weed. I want a bit of a chat with you, Philip. I obeyed, taking one of the very fine cigars. That would be tobacco, the weed. Well, Uncle Nixon, I encouraged him, wishing to get the chat over because my mind was full of Agnes. I sometimes called him Uncle for fun. Well, my boy, he began, it's no use me beating around the bush. That's another idiom. What do you think of me as a stepfather? I was struck, as they say down there, all of a heap. What? I stammered. You don't mean to say you and mother? He nodded. Yes, I do, lad. Yesterday she promised as she'd marry my unworthy self. I'd been coming along for some time, but I don't expect she'd give you any hint in her letters. In fact, I know she hasn't. It would have been rather difficult, wouldn't it? She couldn't well have written, my dear Philip, an old friend, Mr. Nixon, is falling in love with me, and I believe I'm falling in love with him. One of these days he'll be proposing to me. She couldn't have written like that, could she? I laughed. I could not help it. Shake hands, I said warmly. I'm delighted. And soon afterwards, my mother sidled in shyly. The lad's delighted, Sarah, said Mr. Nixon shortly. I said nothing about my own engagement that night. I had never thought of my mother as a woman with a future. I had never realized that she was desirable, that a man might desire her, and that her lonely existence in that house was not all that she had the right to demand from life. And I was ashamed of my characteristic philia selfish egoism. So I decided that I would not intrude my joys on hers until the next morning. We live and we learn. Filial is like it has to do with this guy, this Freud, Sigmund Freud, and you could definitely do Sigmund Freud believed that all boys when they're babies and like toddlers were in love with their mothers, and then all girls when they're babies and toddlers are like in love with their fathers. Freud was kind of a weirdo. But we could say this is the irony because no, we were not expecting, well, Philip definitely wasn't expecting his mother to have the same news as he does. And then we would call this down here an epiphany, okay? Because young Philip, who really isn't that young, he has to be at least 25 years old, but basically Philip has went his entire life, including his adult life, thinking that his mother was just some fixture of his house, like similar to maybe a doorway. I'm not really sure. You could definitely say that Philip had some reflection here. For whenever you have a character that says in a story, I had never thought of, and that is it happening towards the end, and they have you could say a somewhat dramatic realization about their behaviors or their situation, and an epiphany causes a character to become dynamic, where they change somehow their ideologies. Ideologies just mean the way they think or feel about things. That would make Philip a dynamic character. He began the story thinking that his mother was just some fixture of the house that was just there to be his mother, and that was it. And in the end, he realizes that his mother is indeed a human person that has relationships. You can definitely find a lot of evidence in the story that we can paint Philip to be this villain. We could also paint the mom to be the villain, or Mr. Nixon's hard to paint the villain because it does say he's jovial and he's a good landlord, and that he's respected, but we could find a way. So that would be our annotated reading. Oh, and most important, whenever you're reading old timey stories, authors used to love to do this. So when it says, she was preparing for me, now we know why that is in quotations, because she was preparing for Mr. Nixon. And that'll be, and the next one will go over our literary elements and our devices.